Some people should know which room they belong in. The words floated across the ballroom so clearly that even the string quartet seemed quieter for a moment. Conversations slowed. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. Hundreds of guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos turned their heads toward the center of the room. At the Grand Regency Hotel in Manhattan, where money moved as easily as champagne and reputations were traded like currency, silence was rare. Yet for a few seconds, silence was exactly what filled the air. Everett Caldwell stood beside the head table reserved for the city's most influential investors and executives. At 61, the billionaire chairman of Caldwell Holdings carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades getting whatever he wanted. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His custom black tuxedo fit flawlessly. Around him stood members of his family, smiling politely as guests laughed at private jokes and celebrated what many believed would be the business announcement of the year. Across from him stood Zora Bennett. She wore a simple midnight blue evening dress and a silver bracelet that caught the light whenever she moved. She had not come to attract attention. In fact, she preferred the opposite. But attention had found her anyway. A few moments earlier, one of Everett's sons had brushed past her while carrying a champagne flute. The drink splashed across the floor near her feet. The young man laughed. Several guests laughed with him. Then Everett looked at Zora, studied her for a second, and delivered the comment that now hung over the ballroom like smoke. Some people should know which room they belong in. A few nervous chuckles followed. Others looked away. Nobody challenged him. Nobody asked whether he knew who she was. Zora glanced down briefly before lifting her eyes again. Her expression never changed. No anger. No embarrassment. No dramatic response. Just calm. The kind of calm that often appears when someone has already learned that dignity is more valuable than approval. Everett dismissed the moment with a wave of his hand and returned to greeting investors. The music resumed. Conversations returned. Waiters continued weaving through the ballroom carrying silver trays. It looked as though the evening had recovered. But appearances can be deceptive. Because hidden behind the laughter and luxury was a truth that nobody in that room understood. Not Everett Caldwell. Not his family. Not the reporters waiting near the stage. Not even the executives preparing tomorrow's headlines. The woman they had just humiliated was quietly carrying the authority to influence the fate of a $900 million deal. A deal everyone in the ballroom believed was already finished. A deal that had taken nearly 2 years of negotiations, legal reviews, and international financing to assemble. And before the night was over, that deal would no longer exist. If you enjoy stories about justice, courage, and unexpected reversals, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. Beyond the ballroom windows, Manhattan sparkled beneath a cool spring sky. The Hudson River reflected thousands of lights from glass towers stretching into the darkness. Inside, anticipation continued to build. Caldwell Holdings was preparing to announce a transformative partnership with an international investment consortium. Financial journalists were already calling it the most significant transaction of the year. Investors expected enormous returns. Analysts predicted rapid expansion. Everything appeared perfect. Yet perfection has a way of hiding fragile foundations. As Everett Caldwell smiled beneath the chandeliers and accepted congratulations from guests who assumed success was inevitable, Zora Bennett quietly stepped away from the crowd and toward the edge of the ballroom. Nobody followed her. Nobody stopped her. And nobody realized that the future of the evening had just walked out of the spotlight. Zora Bennett moved through the quieter edge of the ballroom with the same calm composure she had carried through most of her life. Beyond the crowd, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River, where reflections of Manhattan shimmered across dark water like scattered stars. The music softened as she stepped away from the center of the celebration. Laughter still echoed behind her. Champagne glasses still clinked. Conversation still revolved around stock prices, acquisitions, and influence. Yet the further she moved from the crowd, the easier it became to breathe. Zora had never been particularly impressed by wealth. Growing up in Baltimore, she learned early that money could buy comfort but not character. Her mother taught 8th grade science for nearly 30 years. Her father repaired city buses and spent weekends volunteering at community centers. Neither earned enough to appear on magazine covers, but both earned something Zora valued more: respect. They taught her that intelligence meant little without humility, and that true confidence never needed an audience. Those lessons stayed with her. They carried her through college, through graduate school, and eventually into the world of international finance. By 34, she had built a reputation that most people in the ballroom would have admired had they known about it. She specialized in mergers, acquisitions, and long-term investment risk. Her reports influenced decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Executives trusted her judgment. Investment funds relied on her analysis. Yet she rarely appeared in public announcements. She preferred staying behind the scenes. Results mattered more than recognition. Tonight was no exception. Most guests assumed she was simply another attendee who had somehow wandered into the wrong section of the gala. Few realized she represented the investment consortium preparing to finalize the $900 million partnership with Caldwell Holdings. Fewer still understood that her recommendations carried enormous weight with the consortium's board. The final approval process was still underway. Officially, nobody possessed unilateral authority. Unofficially, everyone involved knew Zora's assessment would influence the outcome more than any presentation delivered that evening. She paused near a tall marble column and watched servers move through the ballroom carrying silver trays beneath golden light. Across the room, Everett Caldwell stood surrounded by investors. His family occupied the center of attention as photographers captured images destined for financial publications and social media feeds. Success seemed inevitable from a distance. Yet something about the evening unsettled her. Not because of the insult. She had encountered prejudice before. What troubled her was what the incident revealed. Business partnerships depended on trust. Trust depended on character. And character revealed itself most clearly when there was nothing to gain. A family willing to humiliate someone they believed was unimportant raised questions that spreadsheets could not answer. Questions about leadership. Questions about judgment. Questions about culture. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from one of the consortium's senior directors. The board would conduct its final review later that evening. Additional observations from the gala were welcome. Zora read the message twice before slipping the phone back into her purse. She said nothing. Around her, the celebration continued growing louder. Near the stage, executives prepared for the formal announcement scheduled later that night. Spotlights illuminated banners displaying the Caldwell name. Reporters adjusted cameras. Guests filled their glasses once again. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody suspected the future of the transaction remained uncertain. As Zora looked across the ballroom toward the family receiving applause and congratulations, she felt a quiet heaviness settle in her chest. The numbers supporting the deal were impressive. The strategy made sense. The growth potential was real. But business was never only about numbers. And before the night ended, she would have to decide whether the people behind those numbers deserved something far more valuable than capital. Trust. Everett Caldwell had spent most of his life believing that success proved character. The logic seemed simple to him. Build enough companies, create enough jobs, accumulate enough wealth, and eventually people would stop questioning your judgment. For decades, that belief appeared correct. He transformed Caldwell Holdings from a regional manufacturing business into one of the most influential investment groups in the country. Financial magazines called him visionary. Business schools studied his acquisitions. Television anchors repeated his opinions as though they were economic forecasts. Somewhere along the way, admiration hardened into certainty, and certainty slowly became arrogance. Across the ballroom, Everett accepted congratulations with practiced ease. Investors shook his hand. Politicians smiled for photographs. Executives laughed at stories they had likely heard before. His family stood beside him, equally comfortable beneath the glow of attention. They had grown accustomed to being the most important people in every room they entered. Tonight felt no different. His eldest son, Brandon Caldwell, moved confidently through groups of guests, carrying himself with the same effortless entitlement that wealth often produced. Brandon was 32, handsome, charismatic, and convinced that success belonged naturally to people like him. He rarely questioned assumptions because assumptions had rarely failed him. Near the stage, he laughed with several venture capital executives while discussing the upcoming partnership announcement. To Brandon, the deal was already completed. The gala was simply the victory lap. Everett shared that confidence. The transaction had taken nearly 2 years to negotiate. Teams of lawyers had reviewed contracts. Consultants had examined financial projections. Advisors had studied every risk model. The consortium's capital would open international markets and accelerate expansion plans that Caldwell Holdings had pursued for years. $900 million represented more than money. It represented validation, proof that the Caldwell name still carried extraordinary influence. A server passed with a tray of champagne. Everett accepted a glass and turned toward the ballroom windows. Beyond the glass, Manhattan glowed beneath the night sky. The city looked limitless from 40 stories above the streets. He enjoyed that view. It reminded him how far he had come. Yet while Everett admired the skyline, another conversation unfolded nearby. 2 consortium representatives stood near a marble pillar speaking quietly. One mentioned Zora Bennett's name. The other immediately nodded. Their tone carried respect, the kind reserved for people whose opinions mattered. Neither noticed Everett standing within earshot. He barely registered the exchange anyway. The name meant little to him. Just another guest among hundreds. Another face in a crowded ballroom. Had he paid closer attention, he might have recognized the opportunity hidden in that moment. Instead, his focus remained fixed on the celebration surrounding him. The orchestra transitioned into a softer melody. Spotlights illuminated the stage where company leaders would soon deliver speeches. Reporters adjusted camera angles. Screens displayed polished graphics promoting the future partnership. Everything looked perfect, but perfection often hides warning signs beneath its surface. Everett glanced across the ballroom and briefly spotted Zora standing alone near the windows. For an instant their eyes met. She looked away first and returned her attention to the city beyond the glass. Everett dismissed the moment immediately. He had already decided who she was. And once he made decisions about people, he rarely reconsidered them. That habit had served him well in negotiations. It had helped him build an empire. Tonight, however, it was leading him toward a mistake larger than anything on the balance sheet spread across his boardroom. Because while the Caldwell family celebrated a future they believed was guaranteed, the person capable of influencing that future was quietly observing everything. Not the financial projections, not the speeches, not the luxury surrounding them. She was watching something far more important. How they treated people when they believed those people had nothing to offer in return. The evening continued unfolding exactly as the Caldwell family expected. Guests filled the ballroom with laughter and conversation. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections across marble floors. Waiters moved gracefully between groups of investors and executives carrying silver trays filled with sparkling drinks. Near the stage, a giant digital display counted down the minutes until the formal announcement. Every detail had been carefully planned. Every speech rehearsed. Every camera positioned to capture what the family believed would become one of the most celebrated moments in company history. Yet as Zora watched the room from a distance, she became increasingly aware of something numbers could not measure. Culture, character, leadership, the qualities hidden behind public relations campaigns and polished presentations. Her phone vibrated once more. Another message from the consortium board appeared on the screen. Several directors were monitoring the gala remotely. They wanted updates regarding the atmosphere, leadership interactions, and final impressions before the vote. The message was simple. Observations matter. Zora read the words carefully. Then she slipped the phone back into her purse without responding. Across the ballroom, Brandon Caldwell was entertaining a group of young investors with stories about future expansion plans. His confidence drew attention, but his behavior revealed something else. Throughout the evening he interrupted staff members, ignored servers attempting to assist guests, dismissed people who could offer no obvious advantage. Each incident was small on its own, almost invisible, yet together they formed a pattern. And patterns were something Zora never ignored. Near the entrance, she noticed an elderly hotel employee struggling to maneuver a cart through a crowded section of the ballroom. Several guests stepped around him without acknowledgement. One nearly bumped into the cart while checking messages on a phone. The employee apologized repeatedly despite doing nothing wrong. Zora quietly crossed the room and helped guide the cart through the crowd. The man thanked her with visible relief. She smiled and returned to her place near the windows. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Most people never noticed. One person did. A senior representative from the investment consortium standing near the bar observed the entire interaction. He offered Zora a small nod of recognition before returning to his conversation. Moments later, Everett Caldwell stepped onto the stage to rehearse part of his upcoming remarks. Applause followed immediately. Spotlights illuminated the Caldwell logo behind him. His voice carried easily through the ballroom. He spoke about growth, innovation, partnerships, and vision. The audience listened attentively. The speech was polished, impressive, professional. Yet while others focused on the words, Zora found herself studying the reactions around him. Family members smiled proudly. Executives nodded enthusiastically. Investors appeared satisfied. Everything looked perfect from a distance. Then Everett concluded his remarks and stepped down from the stage. As he moved through the crowd, one of the hotel's event coordinators approached with a minor scheduling question. The woman spoke respectfully. Everett barely looked at her before handing the issue to an assistant and walking away. Another small moment. Another subtle choice. Another signal. None of these incidents alone would influence a $900 million transaction. But together they painted a picture. Leadership was not tested when cameras were watching. It was revealed during ordinary moments. Zora understood that better than most. Across the ballroom, the countdown clock continued moving toward the official announcement. Excitement grew stronger. Reporters prepared questions. Guests filled fresh glasses. The Caldwell family appeared increasingly confident that the evening belonged to them. Yet as Zora stood quietly beside the windows overlooking Manhattan, she realized her concerns were no longer limited to a single insult. What troubled her now was much larger. The deeper she observed, the more she wondered whether the consortium was about to enter a partnership with people who valued status more than respect. And if that was true, the most important decision of the night might not be whether the deal moved forward. It might be whether it should. As the countdown clock above the stage slipped below 15 minutes, the energy inside the ballroom shifted from celebration to anticipation. Guests moved closer to the center of the room. Television crews adjusted their cameras. Investors exchanged optimistic predictions about what the partnership would mean for future growth. The air seemed charged with expectation. Everywhere Zora looked, people behaved as though the outcome had already been decided. Yet she knew better. The consortium board had not cast its final vote. The official announcement had not been approved. The future everyone was celebrating remained uncertain. Near the stage, Brandon Caldwell spotted Zora standing beside a group of consortium representatives. His expression tightened immediately. Earlier, he had dismissed her as someone who did not belong among the evening's most important guests. Seeing her now in conversation with influential attendees appeared to irritate him. He crossed the ballroom with two friends trailing behind him. Several guests stepped aside as he approached. The confidence in his stride carried the familiar certainty of someone accustomed to getting his way. "There you are," Brandon said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Conversations around them began to quiet. "I thought the staff entrance was on the other side of the hotel." A few people laughed nervously. Others looked uncomfortable. Zora remained calm. "Good evening," she replied. Brandon smirked. "You seem to spend a lot of time around important people for someone who does not appear on the guest list." One of his friends chuckled. Another glanced around to see who was watching. More guests turned toward the exchange. The atmosphere grew noticeably tense. Zora could have corrected him. She could have explained exactly why she was there. She could have introduced herself properly and ended the misunderstanding in seconds. Instead, she simply said, "Everyone deserves respect regardless of where their name appears." The response only seemed to frustrate Brandon further. Before he could answer, Everett Caldwell approached. Several reporters nearby immediately shifted their attention toward the gathering. Everett looked from his son to Zora. Recognition flickered across his face. "You again," he said. His tone remained polite on the surface, but the message beneath it was clear. "We are preparing for a private announcement." Zora met his gaze. "I understand." Everett glanced briefly toward the consortium representatives standing nearby. "Then I am sure you understand why certain areas are reserved for invited participants." The words landed heavily. Not because they were loud, because they were deliberate. The implication was impossible to miss. Several guests lowered their eyes. One reporter quietly stopped taking notes. Across the room, a few consortium representatives exchanged uneasy looks. The elderly hotel employee Zora had helped earlier stood near a service station and watched silently. For a moment nobody spoke. The orchestra continued playing softly in the background. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead. Manhattan glowed beyond the glass walls. The ballroom remained beautiful, yet the atmosphere felt colder than before. Everett turned toward a nearby event manager. "Please make sure our guest is directed to the appropriate area." The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, Everett did not wait for a response. He simply walked away. Brandon followed with a satisfied smile. Around them, conversations gradually resumed. The crowd attempted to move on, but the damage had already been done. Zora stood quietly for several seconds. Not embarrassed, not angry, just disappointed. What troubled her most was not how they treated her. It was how easily they treated someone they believed had no influence. Nearby, one consortium representative slowly lowered his glass. Another checked a message on his phone before looking toward Zora with growing concern. Across the ballroom, the countdown clock continued ticking toward the announcement everyone expected. Yet for the first time that evening, a different possibility had begun to emerge. And while the Caldwell family remained focused on celebrating their future, the people responsible for deciding that future were starting to question whether it should belong to them at all. Zora quietly stepped away from the center of the ballroom before anyone could see the disappointment in her eyes. The music continued behind her, elegant and polished, drifting through the air beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Guests laughed. Glasses touched. Cameras flashed. Yet the farther she moved from the crowd, the more distant those sounds became. She followed a corridor leading toward a private terrace overlooking the city. A cool evening breeze greeted her the moment she stepped outside. Manhattan stretched endlessly before her, illuminated by millions of lights reflecting across the dark surface of the Hudson River. The city looked calm from above, timeless, indifferent to the triumphs and failures unfolding inside luxury hotels. Zora rested her hands lightly against the stone railing and looked out toward the skyline. Behind her, muffled applause echoed from the ballroom. The Caldwell family was likely receiving another round of congratulations. She could almost picture it without turning around. Smiles, handshakes, confidence, assumptions. The same assumptions that had shaped nearly every interaction she had experienced that evening. A soft breeze moved through her hair. For several moments she allowed herself to simply stand there in silence. Not thinking about contracts. Not thinking about investment committees. Not thinking about the deal. Just breathing. The city lights shimmered across the water below like scattered fragments of gold. Her phone vibrated gently in her purse. She removed it and looked at the screen. Several messages had arrived from consortium board members. They wanted her final recommendation before the vote. No urgency. No pressure. Just a request for her professional judgment. Zora stared at the messages without responding immediately. She knew exactly what everyone expected her to evaluate. Financial strength, growth potential, market position, international expansion opportunities. The numbers remained attractive. The business strategy remained sound. None of that had changed. What had changed was something harder to measure. Character, trust, leadership. The qualities that determined how people behaved when there was nothing to gain and no consequences to fear. She thought about the elderly hotel employee she had helped earlier. She thought about the event coordinator dismissed without acknowledgement. She thought about the comments directed toward her throughout the evening. None of those moments alone would define an organization. Yet together they painted a picture. And pictures mattered. Because culture always started at the top. A door behind her opened softly. Zora glanced over her shoulder. One of the consortium representatives stepped onto the terrace carrying a glass of water. He approached slowly before stopping beside her. For a few seconds neither spoke. Together they looked out over the city. "Beautiful view," he finally said. "It is," Zora replied. He nodded thoughtfully. "The board is waiting for your recommendation." Zora looked back toward the skyline. I know. The representative remained silent. He had worked with her long enough to understand that she never rushed important decisions. After another moment he spoke again. The numbers support the partnership. They do. But... Zora exhaled slowly. The cool air felt refreshing against her skin. Business relationships last longer than spreadsheets. The representative considered the answer carefully. Then he nodded. He understood. No further explanation was necessary. The two stood quietly as the lights of Manhattan reflected across the river below. Somewhere inside the hotel, a countdown continued moving toward an announcement the Caldwell family believed was inevitable. Yet out on the terrace beneath the night sky and far from the applause, the future of that announcement was quietly changing. And for the first time all evening Zora felt complete clarity. The decision before her was no longer complicated. It was simply difficult. Inside the ballroom the countdown clock reached 0. Applause erupted as spotlights swept across the stage and illuminated the enormous Caldwell Holdings logo suspended above the audience. Reporters raised cameras. Investors straightened their jackets. Executives exchanged confident smiles. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Everett Caldwell stepped onto the stage beneath a wave of applause and accepted the microphone. The confidence in his expression reflected a man who believed he was standing at the beginning of another historic success. Beside him, members of his family smiled proudly while photographers captured every angle. Across the ballroom, giant screens displayed images celebrating the future partnership. The atmosphere felt electric, certain, victorious. Everett began speaking about growth, opportunity, and vision. His voice carried easily through the room. Guests listened attentively. Some recorded videos on their phones. Others whispered predictions about how the transaction would reshape the industry. Everything appeared perfectly aligned. Then a movement near the side of the stage caught the attention of several executives. One of Caldwell Holdings' senior legal advisors was approaching quickly. His expression lacked the excitement filling the room. In fact, he looked alarmed. The attorney stopped beside the stage and spoke quietly to another executive. The executive's face immediately lost color. A second phone appeared. Then a third. Within seconds, several members of leadership were checking messages simultaneously. Everett noticed the shift and paused briefly. The room remained unaware. Most guests assumed it was a minor logistical issue. But near the front tables, concern began spreading from one person to another. The attorney climbed the stage stairs and approached Everett directly. He whispered something into his ear. The change was immediate. Everett's confident smile disappeared. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. More fragile. Ladies and gentlemen, Everett said slowly, attempting to maintain composure. Please excuse me for one moment. Murmurs spread through the audience. Reporters lowered cameras. Investors exchanged confused looks. Near the back of the room, several consortium representatives remained seated, their expressions calm and unreadable. On a private terrace overlooking the city, Zora stood beside the stone railing and watched the lights shimmer across the Hudson River. Her phone vibrated. A message appeared from the consortium board chairman. The vote was complete. The partnership had been rejected. The recommendation had been accepted unanimously. Zora read the message once before placing her phone back into her purse. She felt no satisfaction, no excitement, only a quiet sadness that things had reached this point. Back inside the ballroom, confusion had become impossible to hide. Executives gathered in small groups. Lawyers reviewed messages repeatedly as though the words might change. Then the official notice arrived. The consortium had withdrawn from the transaction. Effective immediately. The planned partnership would not move forward. A wave of disbelief swept across the room. $900 million had vanished in a single decision. Questions emerged instantly. Why? What happened? How could this occur on the very night of the announcement? The answer arrived moments later. The consortium's statement cited concerns regarding leadership culture, professional conduct, and long-term organizational values. The words struck harder than any financial loss, because they challenged something money could not easily repair. Reputation, trust, character. Everett stared at the message on his phone. Around him, conversations blurred into background noise. Then his eyes stopped on a single name appearing near the bottom of the recommendation summary. Zora Bennett. For several seconds he simply looked at it. The woman his family had dismissed. The woman they assumed did not belong. The woman they had treated as insignificant. She had not destroyed the deal. She had simply told the truth. And in that moment, standing beneath the chandeliers while the celebration collapsed around him, Everett Caldwell finally understood that the most important person at the gala had never been standing on the stage. She had been quietly watching from the edge of the room all along. The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. The orchestra had stopped playing. Conversations that once filled the room with confidence had been replaced by uneasy whispers and stunned silence. Reporters lowered their cameras. Investors checked messages repeatedly. Executives stood in small groups trying to understand how a transaction that had seemed inevitable less than an hour earlier had disappeared. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the ballroom with the same golden light, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Across the room, members of the Caldwell family struggled to hide their disbelief. Brandon stood motionless near the stage, staring at his phone. For perhaps the first time in his life, confidence offered no answers. Everett Caldwell remained near the center of the ballroom, holding the consortium statement in his hand. He read the final paragraph again. Then again. The words did not change. Concerns regarding leadership culture. Concerns regarding professional conduct. Concerns regarding organizational values. The language was formal, polite, yet its meaning was unmistakable. This was never about numbers. It was about people. Everett slowly lowered the phone and looked toward the terrace doors at the far side of the ballroom. Beyond the glass, he could see the silhouette of a woman standing beneath the city lights. For a long moment he remained still. Then, without speaking to anyone, he began walking toward the terrace. Guests noticed him passing but stepped aside without interruption. The farther he moved from the crowd, the quieter the room seemed to become. Outside, the cool night air carried the distant sounds of Manhattan traffic far below. Zora remained beside the stone railing overlooking the Hudson River. The skyline stretched across the horizon in a field of white and gold lights. She heard the terrace door open behind her but did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Everett approached slowly before stopping several feet away. For a few seconds neither spoke. The silence felt heavier than any conversation they could have had. Finally Everett looked out toward the city and exhaled. "I know who you are now," he said quietly. Zora turned toward him. Her expression remained calm. "I imagine you do." Everett lowered his eyes briefly. The simple response carried no anger, no satisfaction. Somehow that made the moment more difficult. "The board accepted your recommendation." They did. And they were right to trust it. The admission seemed to cost him something. Yet he continued. "When I first saw the statement, I thought the deal had collapsed because of one interaction." He paused. "I was wrong." Zora listened without interrupting. Everett glanced toward the ballroom behind them. "The truth is that tonight revealed things I should have seen years ago." The city lights reflected across the river below. A cool breeze moved through the silence between them. "This was never about one comment," Zora said softly. Everett nodded. "No. It was about what that comment represented." The words settled between them. Honest. Difficult. Necessary. Everett looked away for a moment before speaking again. "I spent years believing success excused certain behavior." His voice carried none of the certainty it had earlier that evening. "Somewhere along the way I stopped paying attention to how people experience this company." Zora studied him carefully. For the first time all night she saw no arrogance. Only reflection. "Companies become what their leaders tolerate," she said. Everett absorbed the statement without argument, because he knew it was true. Behind them, the ballroom remained filled with unanswered questions and disappointed expectations. Yet out on the terrace something more important was taking place. Not a negotiation. Not a transaction. An acknowledgement. A recognition that respect could not be purchased, inherited, or demanded. It had to be practiced. And for the first time that evening, Everett Caldwell was finally willing to listen. Neither of them spoke for several seconds after that. The city stretched endlessly before them, glowing beneath the night sky like a field of distant stars. Far below, Traffic moved through Manhattan in steady streams of white and red light. The Hudson River reflected the skyline in long ribbons of silver and gold. Behind them, the ballroom continued emptying as guests quietly departed, carrying home a story very different from the one they expected to witness. The celebration was over. The speeches no longer mattered. The carefully prepared announcements had lost their purpose. What remained was something much harder to ignore. Truth. Everett rested his hands lightly against the terrace railing and looked out across the city he had spent his life trying to conquer. For decades he believed leadership meant making the right decisions. Tonight had taught him that leadership also meant listening to the right people. The lesson arrived later than it should have, but it arrived nonetheless. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. The words were simple, unpolished, honest. Zora looked at him for a moment before turning her eyes back toward the skyline. "Thank you," she replied. Everett nodded slowly. He understood that some mistakes could not be erased by a single conversation. Respect lost through arrogance required more than words to restore. Yet he also understood that acknowledging the mistake was where responsibility began. The terrace fell silent again. A cool breeze moved through the night air. Somewhere below, a ferry crossed the river, its lights drifting slowly across the dark water. The city carried on exactly as it always had. Indifferent to fortunes gained or lost. Indifferent to pride. Indifferent to status. Zora reached into her purse and removed her phone. Several new messages had arrived from consortium directors thanking her for her recommendation and her professionalism throughout the evening. She read them briefly before placing the phone away again. The decision was finished. The board had spoken. There was nothing left to negotiate. Nothing left to defend. Everett noticed the gesture and smiled faintly. Not the confident smile he had worn earlier that evening. Something quieter. More thoughtful. "You know," he said, "all night I kept asking how the deal disappeared." He looked down briefly before continuing. "Now I think I understand that it disappeared long before the vote." Zora studied him carefully. "How so?" Everett glanced toward the ballroom doors. "The moment we stopped treating people with respect, we started losing things we could not see." The answer surprised even him. Yet the more he thought about it, the more true it felt. Zora nodded. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes. Character always shows up eventually. Everett smiled again, this time with genuine understanding. For the first time all evening, there was no tension between them. No power imbalance. No assumptions. Just two people standing beneath the same sky, looking at the same city, understanding the same lesson from different directions. After a while, Zora checked the time. It was late. The evening had finally reached its natural end. "I should go," she said. Everett nodded. "Of course." She turned toward the terrace doors. After a few steps, Everett spoke once more. "Miss Bennett." Zora looked back. For a brief moment, neither said anything. Then Everett extended his hand. No audience. No reporters. No investors. No family members. Just a simple gesture offered without expectation. Zora looked at the hand, then at the man offering it. Slowly, she smiled and accepted it. The handshake lasted only a second, yet it carried more meaning than every introduction made inside the ballroom that night. When their hands parted, Zora nodded politely and walked back through the doors. Her footsteps disappeared into the quiet hotel corridors. Everett remained on the terrace alone. The wind moved gently across the river below. The lights of Manhattan shimmered against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the clouds had finally cleared, revealing a sky brighter than the one that had greeted the evening. And standing there above the city, Everett Caldwell understood something that no balance sheet, contract, or billion-dollar transaction had ever taught him. The value of a person could never be measured by wealth, status, or the room they appeared to belong in. It could only be measured by the dignity they carried wherever they stood.